Welcome back to Pagebreak Podcast with Rich and Brian. We've got our guest on today, Donavin Calmer. He's one of our authors at Genesis Publishing House. He is a native Okie, or he lives in Oklahoma. We don't live far from each other. We've actually had breakfast together several times, and so I've really enjoyed getting to know Mr. Calmer and his story and his book. And so today we're just excited to jump in and chat with him about that.
Absolutely.
And good to have Brian on as well. Brian, I'm going to kick it to you for a first question, and we'll just jump right into this interview.
Yeah. So, Donovan, thanks for being on here. Let's go back to the beginning. So, you had an idea for this book. Maybe it was a year ago. Maybe it was 10 years ago. But in your mind, when did you start thinking about, okay, this is a story I want to put together and I want to share? Go back to the beginning for us.
Well, it's been a long time in the process of the book, but let's go back maybe 12, 13 years ago, and in our church, I did a Christmas letter for a ministry called Heart of Craftsman, and I'd send it out to a lot of people, but especially people in our church, and an older couple. A lady walked up to me and she said, "I really enjoyed your Christmas letter, but," she said, "you really ought to write a book." And I looked at her and I smiled and I go, "Well, that's the farthest thing from uh, ever thinking about writing a book." And I said, "I appreciate your encouragement." And so it went on years and years, and anyway, they were in a nursing home, and I'd still send Christmas letters, and she sent a Christmas card to me and said, "When you gonna write the book?" And that's when it really hit me that this is something I needed to do. I especially wanted to do it for my family, for my grandkids, and for uh, grandkids, family members not yet born. And anyway, about 3 years ago, I started, and on the process, a lot of encouragement from friends. And we finally finished it, got in touch with Richard and Genesis Publishing, and then he helped me and Genesis helped me with the process, and we finally were able to come to a conclusion there in, I think it was September or October of last year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we're extremely happy with how the book turned out. It was interesting. Our first conversation, we met. I can't remember if we met at Mom's Diner the first time. We've met at several Greasy Spoon diners over the last
We did.
6 or 9 months, and that's my. I don't think. I mean, breakfast is not just the best meal of the day; it's the best meal of all time. So I like meeting for breakfast. But we got to talking. Tulsa's not a small town, but it's not huge. And he mentioned some things that sounded familiar to me. And I said, well, my kids went to school at Summit, and he said, well, my granddaughter goes to Summit, and it
Yeah.
turned out that my son and she graduated in the same year, and his daughter taught my daughter. So we had a lot of overlap that we didn't know about.
We did.
We're going to talk a little bit about the car here in a minute.
Okay.
And I think that story is going to be a headliner for a lot of people in this interview. But before we get to that, tell me a little bit about your ministry stuff. You've done ministry things around vehicles and worked with kids and that kind of thing. So just talk a little bit about kind of big picture what your ministry life has been like.
Well, if we go back when I was growing up, I just loved cars and working on cars and driving and anyway, after um, 25 years of farming, um, the Lord called me into ministry and started studying for the ministry. Doors opened up. I was able to pastor some little country churches back in Illinois, and it was the Lord kept gently pushing me in the direction of ministry with kids and cars. And we moved to Oklahoma in 2006 and started a ministry called Heart of a Craftsman with our church, New Heart Church here in Broken Arrow. And started working with Tulsa Boys Home, and we had a group of Christian gentlemen that would work on a project and start from scratch and build a hot rod or a classic or an old truck. And then we would pick a week in June and have Tulsa Boys Home come to the church, and then we would go to Tulsa Boys Home also, and we would do a hot rod camp with these boys, and allow them to start from the frame and build the hot rod and put it together with our supervision, with the main purpose of telling our story. And these boys needed to know that Christian men are real. We make mistakes and we have stories uh, how the Lord has brought us through trials and difficult situations. And so I had one of the boys came up to me one time and he goes, "You're a pastor, right?" And I said, "That's correct." And he said, "Are you sure you can do this with these hot rods?" And and I realized at that point that the ministry becomes real when we open our hearts and let them know who we really are.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
great.
that's good. I really like your title, Just a Kid Dreaming About Home. Um, Rich and I are we are very nostalgic people,
I was
and
going to say that exact sentence,
you
except for I
were
was going to say
well. I
except for I was
I,
going to
I
say
was just
Brian and not Rich and I. But yes,
that's crazy. Yeah, because we don't rehearse this. So, but yeah, that we are nostalgic people. So when I did see that title, that nostalgic feeling kind of came back to me. Um, Talk about the writing process, like as you were putting the book together. Did you have those obviously like those memories? I know you were in the service for several years, but just talk about putting the book together as you're writing, and maybe some of the memories, some of the fond memories, or things that are really valuable to you as they were coming back, as you were putting that into words, on a computer screen.
Well, um, I'm one of those yellow ledger page guys and jot notes on it and I had a notebook and I would jot ideas down and put them in the notebook and then um, later on started the process with a laptop which I was not familiar with, so it was a learning process. And it was amazing as I started to look at those notes. Um, Different aspects of the story would come back to me and I could just write them down. But it didn't happen unless I had some kind of a note that would generate the story. And um, for those who grew up in the 50s as kids, there's stories in there for you and for those who um, were baby boomers and in the 60s and cruising and playing the radio and the diner and skating rinks. And so there's stories in there for you also. And the Army was what was a complete 180 flip from the lifestyle of cruising back in the 60s to real life situations. And in effect, we a lot of us grew up quickly in the 60s, no matter no matter whether you were in the service or you weren't in the service. Um, but then readjusting and coming back home, um, my desire was to be a farmer, and doors that opened up and farming, and yet the Lord was still kept pushing me to His purpose for my life, and then moving into the ministry. Um, the I'd say the trials and challenges of ministry were way beyond my comprehension, and only the Lord can bring you through those. Um, but then being able to work with young men and build cars and use that passion as ministry became the opening door for a book. And 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 the book is not about me. It's about if I wrote the book and people think it's about me, then I missed the boat. But if they can relate to a story, whether they grew up in the 50s or they were baby boomers in the 60s, or they were in the service or weren't in the service, or were in ministry or weren't in ministry. If there's a story in there that they can relate to that will give them encouragement, then the book is $1 million book.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
I love
understand.
it. Okay, tell us about so the first time we met, you told me a story about a car that was
Oh,
that was in your life, and then it was out of your life, and then it was back in your life. And so I just wanted our listeners to hear the story about the car. So if you'd share
oh
that.
my, oh my goodness. Well, the story's about Old Blue, and I had the opportunity to tell that story at different hot rod camps in different churches. I got a chance to tell that story at a men's prayer breakfast in Las Vegas at a SEMA show. Um, but if we go way back to when I was 16, I saw this old Ford, and it was a 1950 Ford. I was able to purchase the car, and I took it home. The motor was shot, and my buddies helped me, and we put a new motor in it. I was like in 1964, painted the car blue, and that was my hot rod back in high school. And I got my draft notice for the service. I enlisted in the service in 1966, sold it to my best buddy, and he was drafted later on, and he sold it to one of his brothers. And anyway, after 3 years, I came home in 1969, and I wanted to find Old Blue again, and it had been sent to the junkyard and a scrapyard. So that was really disappointing, and years went by in 1980, and I was farming. Went to see the local Ford dealer, who was a good friend of mine, and he was building a 1950 Ford, and we got to talking about my old car, Old Blue. And anyway, he said, "Hey, I'm going to go get a cup of coffee. You go out back there in the car lot in the last row." And he said, "There's an old Ford back there I use for parts." He said, "Go out there and take a look at it and see if there's anything you could use." And I went out there, and I'm walking around this old Ford, and it's a really faded blue on Ford on flat tires and no hood. I walked around, and I noticed a dash knob off a 57 Oldsmobile, and I go, "Boy, that's really funny because I put a dash knob like that on my Old Blue." And I looked at it a little more, and it was Old Blue. I walked
Wow.
into the dealership, and I said, "Coke," I said, that's my old car." And he said, "Yeah, I know." He said, "I figured it was." And I said, "Well, Coke, you got to sell me the car." And he goes, "No, it's not for sale." And I'm just like, "Oh no." And he turned to his two boys that were working in the dealership, and he said, "You put new tires on that car, and Donovan's going to pick it up on Monday." And so he gave me Old Blue back. I took it back home, um, and I started working on it again. And I mean, I had a family by that time, and we were farming. And but the whole point of what I'm trying to say here is I worshiped that car, and my dad told me I did, and I told him he was wrong, and yet I was right back in the same in the same thing, just working on the car, thinking about it, spending money on it. And the Lord told me one night, he goes, "You got to get rid of the car." I mean, I didn't hear an audible voice, but and I couldn't shake it. I go, "No, no, 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 that's no." And yet I couldn't shake it. And so I got rid of the car. And I felt really good after I did. We were studying for ministry. I was downsizing the farm, and um, so anyway, fast forward to the '90s, late '90s, and I'm pastoring this little church, and we got a dynamic youth leader, and he's got a lot of kids coming weekly. And I said, "We need a hot rod for these kids so they can ride in a hot rod." And of course, I'm going back, I'm dreaming back to the days of Old Blue. I told the congregation, I said, "We're going to believe for a 1950 Ford. We're going to paint it blue, and we'll have it for the kids for ministry." And so we started praying about it, and several months went by, and then a husband and wife came up after service. And he had his head down, and she was smiling, and they came up, and she goes, "My husband has something to tell you." And he looked up, and he said, "I've got 2 old Fords. I've been working on them. They're in my backyard. I'm going to donate them to the church." And so I was really excited, and so were the men of the church. And so the next week we went down with 2 trucks and 2 trailers to pick up the 2 cars. And one car was a 4-door, and it was just a parts car, and the other one was a pretty nice 2-door, but it was red with no motor in it. And so um, one of the elders said, "Pastor, you go ahead and get in the red car, and we'll push you, and you can pretend like it's old blue." And so I'm sitting in the red Ford, and we're pushing it up, and I look down, and on the dash is a '57 Oldsmobile dash top.
Wow.
And I started getting tears in my eyes. It was old blue. And it
Wow.
had 6 owners. And we got it on the trailer, and one of the elders goes, "What are you crying for?" And I go, "It's my old car. It's come back 3 times." And and so we took it back. I stored it out at the farm, and I started worshiping it again. And I don't know, I explain in the book that you have to replace. If you want to get rid of an idol, you got to replace it with something that the Lord has given you. And I realized that I was back in the same trend, and so we got rid of the car. I've not seen it since, but since moving to Oklahoma, found a blue 1954, and I call it Old Blue 2. And if you will, it's been born again. So that's the story of Old Blue, kind of in a nutshell, but there's a whole
Well,
chapter about Old Blue.
yeah.
Yeah, that's
Wow.
great.
That's phenomenal.
Oh, and I don't know how many times I got to tell that story to the kids at Tulsa Boys Home. And every time I did, they just looked at me like, "I can't believe that really happened." So
Yeah.
stories have a purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. For sure.
absolutely.
Well, let's talk about the production process. A lot of times when people go through this, they don't really know. They don't know what to expect. Sometimes they don't know what questions to ask, and is it going to be easy? Is it going to be frustrating, stressful? Talk about your experience, with us here at Genesis, um, as the book's being put together, maybe some different emotions. Sometimes I think when people see the cover for the first time, it kind of feels, that's when it's real. Um, well, let's just kind of walk through your feelings as the book's being put together to the point where you're holding the book for the first time.
Oh, golly. Um, Let me just say it was a real learning process. And I think if we go into writing a book, realize that it's going to be a learning process. First time, I if you'd asked my English teacher back in high school that I'd ever write a book, they'd just go, "You're the last guy in the world that would ever write a book." But leaning on people who've been there, done that, and Genesis has, and for the corrections, and realizing that just because the first time through this is what I said doesn't mean that it's going to be correct. And I got a lot of great suggestions and rewrite and look at it a little differently. Um, the cover is a prime example. I had in my mind exactly what I wanted the cover to look like. And I wanted to do an artist rendition of our farm home growing up, and I wanted to have Old Blue in there. I wanted to have my grandpa and my dad in there because the generations that have lived in that farmhouse. It was purchased in 1920. Um, and I did it, and I would look at that artist rendition, I go, "That doesn't have the right feel to it." And they came out with this cover, and it was a picture of the farmhouse I took years ago at sunset, and they said, "What do you think of this?" And it just right away I knew that's the cover. Right away, I knew it. And then the way that Just a Kid Dreaming About Home was placed on there, it just had a nice, warm, it had a good feel to it.
Yeah. Yeah,
Well,
for
I
sure.
think you hit on some important topics there when we're dealing with a new first time author, and so we have some authors who have published 3, 5. I think we've had a couple that have published 8 or 10 books with us, and so their process is so different. We might get a call from one of these people who have published a bunch, and they just say, "Hey, send me the invoice. Manuscripts are ready. I'm ready. I'm off and rolling." And that book might take 2 or 3 months to get done because they're familiar with the process. When somebody's not familiar with the process, the old saying, "You don't know what you don't know," is pretty true. And so I think, and Donovan, you'd probably agree with this, just what authors need to do when they're brand new is you just ask a lot of questions, uh,
Yes.
and communicate back and forth with your team. You and I sat down and we talked about the cover. And then I went and called the design team after we had breakfast, and we talked about the cover. And between what you looked at and reviewed and it was just exactly like you felt. We felt the same way. That's just
Mm.
it's not hitting the mark the way we want to. And then when we finally got there, you have this big like aha moment almost, like
Yes.
that. This is good. Advice to new authors. I'm going to ask two different lanes of advice. The first one, which is my favorite question to ask because the answers are always different and I love to hear them, is when you're writing the story itself, especially something like this it's not fiction, like these things actually happened. Did you ever get stuck, what people call writer's block? And then how did you overcome that? That's question number one. And then once you got into production, were there times when you were like apprehensive or afraid to ask questions? And then after you did, you were like, I should ask this question like 3 weeks ago or whatever. But I'd love to hear the answer to both of those.
Okay. Um, let's do the second question first. And I'm not original with this, but I keep being reminded, um, no such thing as a dumb question. And you feel like, uh, well, gee, everybody else, to your mind, you think everybody else is a professional and I'm just an amateur. And that feeling of not being able to do it is one of those things that is a crippling has a crippling effect to writing the book. And I would walk away from the book and go, "Well, I'll let somebody else can write a book. I'm not good enough to write a book. I'm not smart enough to write a book." Um, and yet I think the most important thing was encouragement. And I still have, um, where is it? I have, oh, just a minute. There is the note. I don't know if you can see it,
Yeah,
but
we can see it.
that is the note that, that couple wrote me and said, "When you gonna write a book?" And always kept it in front of me. It was in my Bible, it was in my notes, and it was the encouragement of others that caused me to continually keep asking questions, looking for advice. First question, writer's block. Never heard of that before. Uh, but there are times, and this works for me. So I don't know, if it works for anybody else. I do writing at my table where I'm sitting. This is the table that my wife and I um, found in an old farmhouse and had it in our trailer when we got married in 1972. So the table has a lot of memories. But there'll be times when I'll get blocked, and I make several trips back during the year to the farm in Illinois. I'll take my notebook with me and my laptop with me, and I'll go back to the old farmhouse. I have the opportunity to do that. I'm blessed to have the opportunity to still be able to go back to the old farmhouse, go back in the woods where I would go as a kid and take a chair and just sit there and be able to recount stories and be able to pick up and remember great things that happened while I was growing up. And I think that was, nobody's life is perfect, and to be able to relate the mistakes and relate the challenges and then relate the overcoming and the joyfulness of coming out on the other end. I don't know if that answers the questions, Richard, but
Yeah, absolutely. I think well, just for me, because I'm like you, I'm a write it down on an actual piece of paper kind of guy. So I definitely like, and just like Brian said, we're both nostalgic. So the power of nostalgia and the writing it down, both of those things I think are going to be helpful to people who are in a similar situation. We've got time for one more question, Brian. Shoot.
Yeah, one more. I would just ask, what's been the best thing that somebody has told you that's read the book?
You know what? That's an easy one. Um, I was over in Okinawa back in the 60s, two years, Hawk Missile Systems, and I got a great buddy that was at headquarters. We became friends. His name's Tammy Harden, and we lost track of each other after we left Okinawa. And several years ago, actually, it's been 6 years ago, Stamy got a hold of me on Facebook, and I do a small video on Facebook every week and a short video. Anyway, Stamy said, "Are you the guy that was on Okinawa?" And I was so excited. I'm like, "Oh my gosh, it's Stamy!" And anyway, Stamy gave me a real expensive set of a pen and pencil set. And actually they're right over here, the Waterman. And he said, "That's to finish your book." And he read the book. He was the very first one to get a book and read it. And he simply said, called me on the phone and said, "I'm proud of you." And to have an Army buddy, and our paths should have never crossed, but
Mhm.
they did for a purpose. And he encouraged me, write the book.
Yeah,
That's
great.
an awesome story. Well, we are going to recommend that everybody listening go to Amazon or your bookstore of choice and pick up Just a Kid Dreaming About Home by author Donavin Calmer. We're so excited about how it turned out. Loved having you on. Maybe we can do it again sometime in the future. Maybe we can grab breakfast sometime again in the future too.
I look forward to it.
But as for now, thanks for being on, guys. This is Rich and Brian, the Page Break Podcast. We are out.
Have a good day.